I nodded along, listening, taking in every word, not realizing that in just a short time, I would be closer to a gorilla than I had ever imagined. The deeper we went into the jungle, the more it felt like stepping into another world. The air was thick with mist, sunlight barely breaking through the massive canopy above. Every step was careful, deliberate, avoiding twisted roots and damp, uneven ground. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, the scent of wet leaves filling my lungs with every breath. I was completely absorbed in the moment, in the beauty of it all. That was my mistake. I didn't notice how far I had wandered from the group. I didn't hear the guide calling my name, and by the time I realized I was alone, it was too late. The moment I realized I was alone, my stomach dropped. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the dense jungle around me, but the thick vegetation made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sounds of my group, the quiet murmurs, the occasional crunch of footsteps, gone. All I could hear was the distant hum of insects and the rhythmic drip of water from the leaves above. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to retrace my steps, follow the path I thought I had taken, but the problem was, every direction looked the same. I took a cautious step forward, listening, hoping to hear something, anything that would guide me back. But before I could take another, I heard it. A deep, guttural growl. Low, rumbling, so powerful I could feel it in my chest before my brain even processed what it was. My breath caught. My body froze. I didn't know what was watching me, but I knew one thing. It wasn't my group. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the shadows between the trees. And that's when I saw it. Not more than 15 feet away, crouched low in the underbrush, was a shape so perfectly still, it almost blended into the darkness. Then, two golden eyes blinked. A predator. They say your life can change in an instant. One moment you think you have everything under control, and the next, you're staring death in the face, completely powerless. That's exactly what happened to me. I remember the way the air felt that day, thick, humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth and leaves. The jungle was alive with sounds, the distant calls of birds echoing through the trees, the soft rustling of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. In fact, I felt invincible, like nothing could go wrong. I had no idea that within moments, I would be closer to death than I had ever been in my life. But what still haunts me the most is this. When I thought it was all over, when I thought there was no way out, my savior was the last thing I ever expected. I never considered myself someone who took extreme risks. I loved adventure, sure, but I always believed in playing it safe, following the rules, staying aware of my surroundings. That's why, when the opportunity came to trek through one of the most remote jungles in the world, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't just about the thrill. It was about witnessing something truly wild, something untouched by the modern world. The idea of walking through dense, uncharted rainforest, hearing nothing but the sounds of nature, was something I had dreamed of for years. And now, I was finally here. The group I was with was small, just a few experienced guides and a handful of travelers like me, eager to see the jungle's most elusive residents, gorillas. These weren't zoo animals, trained or conditioned to be around people. These were real, powerful creatures, rulers of their domain, moving through the trees like silent ghosts. Our guide told us that if we were lucky, we might catch a glimpse of one from a distance. But he warned us, never get too close, never make sudden movements, and most importantly, never look them directly in the eye. To them, that's a challenge. I didn't know whether it was a leopard, a jaguar, or something else entirely, but I knew I had made a mistake. I had wandered too far, alone, in a place where I was no longer at the top of the food chain. My heart slammed against my ribs as I took a slow, shaky step back. The eyes followed my every movement, I could see the tension in its body, the way its muscles coiled, ready to spring. I had no weapon, no protection, no way to defend myself. And in that moment, I understood. I was prey. I wanted to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. My only chance was to stay as still as possible, to avoid triggering an attack. But before I could even decide my next move, I heard something else. A rustling in the trees behind me, followed by a deep, heavy exhale. And then, a second growl. This one was different. Deeper, louder, more powerful. It wasn't coming from the predator in front of me. It was coming from behind. A wave of fear surged through me as I realized I was caught between two unseen forces. I didn't know what was behind me, but whatever it was big. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of its presence. My instincts screamed at me to turn and look, but I couldn't. I was already locked in a silent standoff with the predator in front of me, its golden eyes flicking from me to whatever was approaching from behind. For a moment, nothing moved. The jungle felt unnaturally quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. And then, it happened. A sudden, thunderous movement from behind me, a deep, guttural roar that sent a shockwave through my entire body. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, raw and primal, filled with a force that made every hair on my skin stand on end. Before I could even process what was happening, the predator in front of me made its decision. In a flash, it turned, muscles rippling, and disappeared into the undergrowth, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The threat was gone. But my terror was far from over. Slowly, cautiously, I turned, and that's when I saw him. A massive silverback gorilla stood just a few feet away, his broad chest rising and falling with each slow breath. His dark eyes locked onto mine, intense and unreadable. He was enormous, easily over 400 pounds, with arms so powerful they could snap a tree branch in half. Every instinct told me to lower my gaze, to show no sign of challenge, to make myself as small and unthreatening as possible. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. This gorilla had scared away a predator. And now, I had no idea what he was going to do next. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. He shifted his weight slightly, tilting his head as if studying me. I had read about gorillas before, how they can be both gentle and fiercely territorial, how they will defend their space with unmatched aggression if they feel threatened. I didn't know why he had come. I didn't know if I was safe, but I did know one thing. At that moment, my life was in his hands. The gorilla didn't move. He just stood there, towering over me, his dark eyes locked onto mine. I could feel the weight of his presence, the sheer power contained within his massive frame. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Every instinct told me to lower my gaze, to avoid any sign of aggression, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what he was thinking. Was he deciding whether I was a threat? Was he protecting his territory? Or had he somehow recognized that I was in danger? Seconds stretched into eternity as we stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. He was close now, so close that I could see the deep lines on his face, the scars that told stories I would never understand. He let out a deep, rumbling exhale, his massive chest expanding, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. But then, something unexpected happened. He turned his head slightly, as if listening for something in the distance. His eyes flickered past me, scanning the jungle behind me, and then he took another step, not toward me, but around me. It took me a moment to understand what he was doing. He wasn't confronting me. He was positioning himself between me and the jungle, between me and whatever else was out there. A strange mix of relief and confusion washed over me. He wasn't acting like an animal defending its territory. He was acting like a guardian, my guardian. I barely dared to breathe as he stood there, his massive back now facing me, his head still scanning the trees. He let out a low, warning grunt, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't for me, it was for something else. And then, as if satisfied that the threat had passed, he took a final deep breath and turned back toward me. This time, there was no tension in his body, no threat, just something I can only describe as understanding. And then, just as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the jungle like a shadow. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to process what had just happened. This wild creature, this powerful being that could have easily ended me, had instead saved me. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but by choice. I didn't know why. Maybe I never would. But one thing was certain. My life had been spared by something I had always been told to fear, and from that moment on, I would never see the world the same way again. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The jungle was still, as if it, too, was letting the moment settle. My legs felt weak, my breath uneven, but somehow I knew I had to move. I had to find my way back. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't the same person who had wandered off the trail earlier. I had come face to face with something ancient, something powerful, something I couldn't explain, and it had spared me. I forced myself to take a step, then another. My body was moving, but my mind was still replaying every detail. The way the gorilla had stood in front of me like a silent protector. The way his presence had sent a predator running. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just nature taking its course. It felt deliberate, purposeful. But why? Had he recognized that I was lost? That I was vulnerable? Had he seen something in me that even I hadn't seen in myself? As I stumbled through the jungle, listening for any sign of my group, the fear that had gripped me earlier began to fade. I wasn't alone in the same way anymore. Somehow I felt connected to the jungle, to the life within it, to the very idea that maybe, just maybe, we don't give these creatures enough credit. We fear them, we misunderstand them, but in that moment, I realized something undeniable. There is more to them than we will ever truly know. Then finally I heard it. Voices, familiar ones, my group. I pushed through the trees, my heart racing in a completely new way now. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled into the clearing where they stood. My guide's eyes went wide. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I opened my mouth, ready to explain, ready to tell them everything. But then, I stopped. Because how could I? How could I put into words what had just happened? Who would believe me? That a gorilla, a wild, untamed force of nature, had saved my life? I just shook my head and let out a shaky laugh. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said. And maybe that was okay. Maybe this story wasn't meant for them. Maybe it was something I was meant to carry with me, a reminder of a moment that would stay with me forever. As we made our way back, I took one last look over my shoulder, back into the trees, back into the mystery that had unfolded before me. And though I saw nothing, I felt it. Somewhere out there, he was watching. Not as a monster, not as something to be feared, but as something far greater than I had ever imagined.